at noon. So welcome everybody. I know our numbers will increase as the next few minutes tick by, but I want to welcome everyone to our grand rounds today for the Department of Medicine. We're really excited for our speaker and our talk today. I want to introduce Dr. Dan Cabrera, who will be doing our formal introduction and then moderating our Q&A at the end. And just as a reminder for anyone who is new to grand rounds with us today, please do post any questions and comments in the chat through the talk. And then at the end, there will be a question and answer that will be moderated towards the end. So we won't have any interruptions mid-talk, but please do post them in there as the talk goes on. But Dr. Dan Cabrera, thank you so much for joining us today. Dr. Cabrera does some incredible work in diversity, equity, inclusion in both the School of Medicine and in the internal medicine residency program. And he's one of our APDs as well. So I'm thrilled to have him, thrilled to have Dr. Dean, and I will turn it over to you now.
All right, great. Thank you, Dr. King. I'm thrilled to be able to introduce Dr. Jason Dean to you all. Just to give you a little bit of background on him, he did his medical school at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis and stayed there to complete a residency in internal medicine and pediatrics, and has completed fellowships in not only pediatric cardiology, but also adult congenital heart disease, which by my account means I think he's quadruple boarded, which is amazing. So, wow, okay. But he's also serving as the vice chair for equity, diversity, and inclusion in the Department of Pediatrics, and he's an associate professor of pediatrics and an adjunct associate professor of medicine in the divisions of cardiology. He currently directs the Indian Health Pathway through the UW School of Medicine's Office of Healthcare Equity. He is also a co-principal investigator of the Strong Heart Study, which is a long-standing epidemiologic study of cardiovascular risk disease and its risk factors in American Indians. And his research encompasses cardiovascular risk stratification in American Indian youth. And on a personal note, I just wanted to comment that I've worked with Dr. Dean over the years in several medical education efforts. And one of the things I value most about him is that he has really over the years created a sense of community with our Native American students and residents so that as they come through the UW system, they feel included and heard. And so that's one of the things that I just wanted to make sure I called out. So without further ado, I will give you over to Dr. Jason Dean.
All right, thanks, Dan. I'm just a glutton for punishment, so. Kinesistawasan, hello, relatives. Thanks for the invite. I really feel the love, even though I'm only an adjunct member of your division. I really feel the love through the computer, and I wish we could be together today. I'll start out by acknowledging that I am on Coast Salish lands, and with that acknowledgement comes a personal commitment to advocate for the health of Native peoples in this land. So if you have that interest and you don't know where to turn, please email me and I can refer you to resources. So I'm going to talk about cardiovascular risk stratification in American Indians today. I'll focus on American Indians because that's where the data is. And I will not be addressing other Indigenous Americans such as Alaska Native people, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders. Although some of the lessons learned from this talk may be applicable to those groups because all Indigenous communities in this country share the same social determinants of health, and they all have a greater than usual prevalence of diabetes mellitus. So no financial disclosures, but I will say that as a MedPeds person, there will be some pediatric discussion towards the end. With these at-risk groups, a lot of their pathologic beginnings happen early in life. So naturally, this is part of the topic in general. I'm not sure how many MedPeds folks are in your division, but I will mention that Susan Hunt has been a national model for what a stellar academic MedPeds physician can be. So if I may editorialize for a second, there needs to be more MedPeds folks in primary care, not only for the obvious adult survivors of pediatric disease, such as adults with congenital heart disease, adults with cystic fibrosis, adult survivors of pediatric malignancies, but also to care for folks like I'm going to talk about today, younger folks who are accumulating, adult pathology, who have that adult pathologic phenotype that may be, best cared for by someone who has internal medicine background. So, and editorial. So this matters. This topic matters to all of us here. Because here in Washington State, we have about 3% of the population is Native. And these were data from the last census. And this is in the setting of a total population of 1.3% across the United States. And naturally, we get a lot of referrals of very ill patients from, Montana, Alaska, and they even have more indigenous patients. So whether you know it or not, you are seeing Indian patients in your clinics and in your hospitals. This is a general outline of what I'm going to talk about today. Just a little bit of epidemiology and talking about the scope of the problem. Why primary prevention is something that we should focus on and why it's successful. I'm going to talk about some challenges in CVD risk screening in American Indians, but using strong heart data, we've developed American Indian specific cardiovascular disease risk calculators that match some of the more well-known models, such as the Framingham risk score. And then again, we'll finish with a little bit of Pete's talk, so please bear with me. So I appreciate your attention. Cardiovascular disease is once thought to be rare in American Indians, but what the folks who were working for the Indian Health Service found was that in the 80s, they were just seeing a lot more of cardiovascular disease. So Dr. Howard, the good Dr. Howard, taught us that there was an exaggerated incidence of coronary heart disease in this paper. And this is due to a variety of different factors, systemic racism and other social determinants of health, poor diet, the prevalence of diabetes, and on and on and on. But what we can see in this paper from 1999 is that strong heart participants, and again, the strong heart study was a large epidemiologic study of cardiac disease in American Indians, that strong heart incidence in the black bar much outpaced, for coronary disease, much outpaced the ERIC study, which is primarily Caucasian. So you can see about double the incident coronary heart disease in this graph. So what we do know from other literature is that, American Indians have an exaggerated prevalence of, classic traditional cardiovascular risk factors such as obesity and diabetes. And this is when compared to the general population. And, the prevalence of these things is very high in American Indian communities. And it is increasing despite us having a very public and strong push to address these things in Native communities here. So unfortunately, American Indians have premature cardiovascular disease mortality and morbidity. It's been written that American Indian mortality rates are about a fifth higher than other US races. And unfortunately, American Indians die of cardiovascular disease at much younger ages. So more than a third will die before the age of 65 compared to only almost 50% of non-Hispanic whites. And I'm sorry about the white centering there. But those are the data. But primary prevention works, right? For you residents, this is something that that we really do a lot of in internal medicine, is we try to prevent a certain disease state before it happens by looking at very well-known risk factors for that certain disease state. So in regards to cardiovascular disease, I would say there's probably a more broad initial line for this that may include historical trauma, systemic racism, poor social conditions, other social determinants of health, poor education. And these lead to things like maladaptive health behaviors or unhealthy behaviors, such as poor diet, physical inactivity, smoking. These, if they are put in place, naturally lead to other things that we screen for, such as obesity and insulin resistance, With underlying obesity and insulin resistance, we have endothelial dysfunction and underlying inflammation, which in turn feeds into formal cardiovascular disease risk factors and other diagnoses that we treat, such as hypertension, diabetes, and dyslipidemia. If these are present, even from a very early age, there are pathologic changes to the cardiovascular system that are not clinically apparent, but are measurable by non-invasive imaging such as echocardiogram or carotid Dopplers. If that is unchecked, it leads to symptoms, morbidity, formal cardiovascular disease, including coronary artery disease, heart failure, and stroke. And again, if unchecked, particularly in natives, it may lead to death. So it's just our challenge is to interrupt this cycle at the bottom of the arrow, rather than trying to deal with things towards the middle to the top of the arrow. So how do we do this? It's a global cardiovascular disease risk assessment, and it's usually based on known risk factors and family history, basically. So, we may look at a person's age, their sex, their smoking history, what their BMI is, or waist circumference, what their blood pressure is, what medicines they're taking, if they have dyslipidemias, what's their glucose metabolism status. And we plug all these things into a risk calculator, and we come up with a global estimate of them having a cardiovascular disease event, basically. And it's usually 10 years in the future. And this has been very successful. So this is something that is an important part of being a general internist, is focusing on primary prevention. So it's been written that in the first decade of the aughts, that annual cardiovascular disease mortality has declined for the general US population by almost 17%. And this is even while the prevalence of known cardiovascular risk factors such as obesity and diabetes have either persisted or increased. So again, we're getting better at screening folks for these issues. We're getting better at treating these issues before they cause incident cardiovascular disease events. And those are the basis. That's the basis of primary prevention. So this reduced cardiovascular disease mortality that we're talking about is probably, the majority of it is probably primary prevention, but there has to be some element of secondary prevention. So after a person has a cardiovascular disease event, how well is their disease state treated to avoid future events? So this really has been best looked at in coronary heart disease. These are old data from the New England Journal, but it's basically looking at the decrease in coronary heart disease mortality from 1980 to 2000 to the year 2000. And they assess not only the United States, but multiple other countries as well, including New Zealand, the Netherlands, Scotland, England. So what they found was that treatments comprise, or secondary prevention efforts, so after someone has an event, treating that disease state to avoid future events, treatments for this comprised a smaller portion of the successes compared to assessment and treatment of risk factors before the event. So again, primary prevention. So it seems that primary prevention still is quite important. And that's why all of your jobs are quite important and quite hard. This is the most well-known cardiovascular disease risk score, the Framingham risk score. A lot of us have these scores on our phones via different applications, and it's kind of a plug and play kind of thing, right? You're seeing someone in clinic, maybe for the first time, maybe it's a repeat visit. You want to see if they need tweaking of their statin. So you plug in all this stuff, right? So it's pretty easy. Put in their age, gender, what their cholesterol status is, if they're a smoker, what their blood pressure is, if they're currently taking medicines, and you click on that 10-year risk score and it comes up with a number, okay? So this may guide your excitement for changing medicines, going up on doses. It may guide how intense you think that they need their primary prevention strategies to be. So in general, less than 10% of having a cardiovascular event in the next 10 years is relatively low risk. 10 to 20% is moderate risk, and over 20% is high risk. So very useful tool. So a little bit about the Framingham study, though. It was begun in 1947 in Massachusetts. There's been 3 cohorts thus far, including an original cohort, their offsprings that were studied in 1971, and then another generation in 2002. It has been wildly successful and important. It's generated over 2,000 publications. It's, for instance, it's how we found out that smoking causes cardiovascular disease. But if we look in general at the cohort itself, there were about 5,200 white men and women with a mean age of 49. So again, we have to ask ourselves, are these data applicable to other groups that we may be seeing? But thankfully, the American Medical Association also had that thought. So what they did is they sought to apply the Framingham risk score to multi-ethnic cohorts, basically. So they included the Strong Heart study, which is our study. What they found was that the Framingham risk score did not accurately estimate coronary heart disease risk for American Indians, particularly American Indian women, and it required some fancy recalibration for overall accuracy to be important, which is, again, not ideal. So why is this? This is one of the tables from the study. So you see here that, there's the ERIC study with primarily Caucasians, but there's an African-American cohort as well. There's a Hispanic cohort. There's a Japanese-American cohort. Here's the Strong Heart data with American Indian men and women. So if we look down at diabetes prevalence as far as an explanation, and here we are. So, compared to other folks in this cohort, Strong Heart participants had much more diabetes mellitus than others. So 42% of American Indian men had diabetes compared to, 6% of whites in the ERIC study, 14% of African-American or Black patients in the ERIC study. Similar findings are seen in American Indian women. 51% had diabetes, compared to 70% of African-American patients in the ERIC study. So so this is the most obvious and blaring difference that may explain what we're seeing clinically. So the American Heart Association also recognized that this is probably an issue. So released a scientific statement. This is an aging paper now, but basically looking at how we should approach primary prevention of cardiovascular disease in racially diverse populations. Frustratingly, there wasn't much written about, and there wasn't much postulated for Indigenous communities in this policy statement, which was kind of a bummer. But thankfully, we have the Strong Heart. The Strong Heart study is a large epidemiologic study of cardiovascular disease and its risk factors. The cohort includes 13 tribal communities in basically 3 areas: the Arizona area, the Oklahoma area, and the Dakotas. It was started in 1988. As I mentioned, the Indian Health Service docs were noticing a lot of cardiovascular disease at that time and sought NIH funding to study these things. It has gone through several iterations, I would say. So the first phase was started in 1988. We are currently planning our 7th exam on the cohort, as well as an offspring cohort, the Strong Heart Family Study, and that is slated to start later this year. So for the MedPeds folks in the audience, the phase 4 and 5, which of the Strong Heart study, which comprised the family study, included adolescents. So there's about 500 young folks in this study. So any interest in doing a secondary data analysis, please don't hesitate to get in contact with me. These are our basic objectives of the study, is to just quantify to quantify prevalent cardiovascular disease and its risk factors. We wanted to also quantify incident cardiovascular disease events, evaluate preclinical cardiovascular disease, because again, Native American Indians have premature cardiovascular disease. And then there was some work on genetic determinants. I will say that the Strong Heart has been a model for community-based participatory research in the country, and we have had just excellent retention rates in this study. And this is partly because there are Indigenous folks who are involved not only in the planning of the study and as principal investigators, but we made a concerted effort early on to train members of the communities that we serve through the study. So in the Dakotas, Oklahoma, and Arizona, those 13 tribal communities, we made a concerted effort to train community members to help with the study. So that said, when it's time for another exam, and in these very small rural communities, occasionally we leverage those relationships, and it's not super HIPAA compliant, but if we're trying to get a hold of someone to come in for their exam and we see their auntie in the grocery store and their auntie did echoes for us at a previous stage, we can just ask her to, text so-and-so. So, kind of the idiosyncrasies of doing research in Native communities. So again, our basic study design, there were 2 American Indian cohorts. The original cohort was about 4,500 patients. These were 45 to 74 years old, most were female, and again, begun in 1988. And then we looked at basically 94 family units during the 4th and 5th phase, and we recruited over 3,600 additional participants. These, again, were a bit younger. 14 years old was the youngest. Again, most were female. This began about 10 years after the initial cohort. And again, we wanted to look at, what was the cardiovascular disease risk profile in younger folks. We wanted to add the identification of genetic risk factors for cardiovascular disease, because again, we were seeing such premature disease. And that was designed in general. So as far as unique cardiovascular disease risk factors that were identified through Strong Heart, albuminuria is something that has come up as a strong predictor of incident cardiovascular disease. This is a reflection of microvascular disease related to diabetes mellitus naturally. There's also elevated fibrinogen was also a unique risk factor. And again, I think this lends importance to the high prevalence of central obesity and the inflammation that comes with that. Left ventricular hypertrophy, as measured by echocardiograms, certain phases in our study had echocardiogram studies obtained. And if a person had, pathologic cardiovascular, preclinical pathologic cardiovascular risk, findings and a pathologic phenotype, that predicted risk. And then some EKG changes were important in women. That's prolonged Q restoration, possibly as a correlate of left ventricular hypertrophy. And this was deemed important in American Indian women. So using these data, we have come up with American Indian specific and sex stratified, because that's also an important factor, risk calculators for coronary heart disease. These were designed for much younger ages than, say, the Framingham risk score. So designed for over 30 years of age. And again, it estimated a 10-year risk of developing coronary heart disease. Not super ideal, because we're trying to surveil younger patients who may have a relatively attenuated 10-year risk of developing cardiovascular disease, but have a high lifetime risk. And that's kind of a struggle that we all are working through. it's kind of, this is what it looks like. Here's the URL. So please consider, if you are seeing, say your clinic is at Harborview and you're seeing Native patients there, please consider using this. You can look it up on the Strong Heart website, so it's just strongheart.org, and you'll see a tab for medical providers, and you'll see the risk calculator scores listed there. They also have, a list of papers that you can kind of look through on that section of the website. But, similar to what we previously saw with the Framingham risk score, it's quite an easy plug and play kind of thing. I will mention that we get urines on our young Native patients if we're worried about their cardiovascular disease status. So that is an addition that you would have to make for your Native patients. But, it's plugging in, strategies for assessing dyslipidemia, their gender, their age, what medicines are taken for their blood pressure, what is their blood pressure, the specific numbers for their cholesterols, if they have diabetes, if they're a smoker, and then assessing micro and macroalbuminuria as far as a measure of a microvascular health in these folks. And again, it kicks out a 10-year risk score. Similarly, we developed a risk calculator for diabetes mellitus. And this is designed for younger patients, 35 years and older, and it estimates the risk of developing diabetes 4 years in the future, so a little bit sooner. Again, very similar kind of logistics to move through the risk calculator. Again, that's the URL at the bottom. Please note that we usually will get urine, so maybe that's one takeaway that that you should keep in mind. There's also a hypertension risk calculator score designed for American Indians 35 years and older, and it's the risk of developing hypertension in the next 4 years. Very similar to what we have already seen. So how have we done more recently with these tools? We have done part of community-based participatory research is not only approaching communities without a overall agenda and helping them through a needs assessment, but it's also disseminating the information that we learned back to the tribes, back to the communities, and back to the docs who actually take care of them. So there's been a big push for returning some of the lessons learned from Strong Heart to these communities. And there's a big push to, contact the physicians who are caring for these communities, whether they're Native or non-Native, and letting them know that there are specific tools that they may leverage. So with this, if we look at the cardiovascular disease morbidity and mortality in American Indians over the last 25 years, while the prevalence of more common cardiovascular disease risk factors such as obesity and diabetes have probably increased, the morbidity and mortality of cardiovascular disease has dropped over the last 25 years in our study cohort. So, we are definitely excited about where the Strong Heart is, about where Strong Heart will go in the future. They brought me on as a co-PI to focus on younger folks, and we'll kind of talk about that for the rest of the talk. But I think I'm on the schedule for a Strong Heart update via the cardiology grand rounds sometime this year. So please look out for that. I'd say the Strong Heart has been wildly successful too. And I just want to mention that, the biggest takeaway from the Strong Heart study was that, cardiovascular disease leads to, that diabetes leads to cardiovascular disease. So that was not known. And that notion came from Strong Heart. So again, important study, always available for folks who are interested in Indigenous cardiovascular disease, health inequities. And we can work out a secondary data analysis, particularly for you, how staff are interested in this sort of research. So please get a hold of me if you're interested in talking about it. But shift a little bit here, put on my MedPeds hat. And I just want to kind of challenge our notion of cardiovascular disease, particularly in Black and brown communities that you may see exaggerated prevalencies, exaggerated incidence of cardiovascular disease, and really changing your notion of how you approach these things. Because in the absence of familial hypercholesterolemia, no one wakes up at age 49 with crushing chest pain after a life of clean living. So I really want to challenge you to reassess your notion of cardiovascular disease and really kind of think that, that atherosclerosis, it starts earlier in life. So really, this is something that we should be talking to the pediatricians about. It should be something that, especially for at-risk groups, it should be something that they get screened for at an earlier age. This cartoon kind of details some of the progression of atherosclerosis. Again, it can start very early in life, from the first decade, with initial kind of fatty streak lesions that build upon themselves over time to more complex atheroma that puts someone at risk for an acute incident cardiovascular disease event. And we've known this for a long time because of great work from the Bogalusa Heart Study, from the pathologic determinants of atherosclerosis in youth study, the PDA study. We know that that this occurs, and this is an important thing. So, for instance, the Bogalusa Heart Study they performed autopsies on about 200 patients, and these were younger patients, aged 2 to 39 years. Patients died of non-cardiac causes, so accidental causes. What they did is for about half the cohort, they knew their antemortem cardiovascular disease risk factors. And what they did is they correlated those risk factors with the extent of pathologic atherosclerosis that was present. So, for instance, they looked at the aorta for some of those lesions that were on the previous cartoon. They looked at the coronary arteries. They looked at fatty streaks, which were initial lesions. They looked at fibrous plaques, which were more complex organized lesions. And what they found was that, as folks accumulated cardiovascular disease risk factors, it was more likely that they would have these subclinical pathologic changes to their cardiovascular systems, even at this super young age, even in that first decade of life. So again, probably a nice good dose response curve in regards to the amount of involvement on these larger arteries and the number of traditional, known, easily screened for cardiovascular disease risk factors that we look for in adults. And so, what do we see in American Indian kids specifically? And I will say that the primary pathologic derangement is probably overnutrition in a lot of these little kids. So this was a large paper looking at prevalence of overnutrition in Indian kids. This graph is from preschool, from toddlers and preschool kids, so 2 to 5 years old, and it basically looked at the proportion based compared to other U.S. races, the proportion of overweight and obese status. So, yeah, excuse me, zooming in because I have presbyopia, but so for instance, the African American population probably has the least amount of overnutrition based on these data. So they would be kind of the dark diamond at the bottom of the graph, but American Indians have the open triangles at the top. So not only do American Indians, based on these data, have more overnutrition when they're little, but you see all other U.S. races for this timeline, 2001 to 2010, the prevalencies were flat, but unfortunately, the prevalence for Indian kids was increased. So again, those previous kids were 2 to 5 years old. These kids, this was a cohort from Arizona. These were from the Pima tribe. The goal of this study was to look at childhood obesity, other cardiovascular disease risk factors, and then relate that to premature death. And what they found was that obese kids were more likely to have premature endogenous mortality, not necessarily from cardiovascular disease, but other things as well. But the more important thing that I took from this study is that, the mean age of this study was 11. So now these kids, the previous study was toddlers and preschoolers, but now by the time they're solidly in school, 11, this is 5th grade. If they were obese, they already started to have glucose intolerance. They already started to have hypertension. And then data from our study, by the time these kids were older, and the mean age for this cohort was almost 16 years old. So this is solidly in high school. And what we found was that a quarter of American adolescents had metabolic syndrome. This is versus about 13% of Hispanic teens, 11% of white teens, and about 2.5% of Black or African American teens. And as you all know, metabolic syndrome is associated with a 2 times risk of cardiovascular disease and a 5 times risk of diabetes. So this shows a very consistent timeline in the medical literature. So what predicts your weight class in Indian kids? This is a very elegant study by Alex Adams. She's currently at Montana State University and does wonderful work with indigenous populations there. But she's from Wisconsin, so these kids were scrawny. And there was about 500 American Indian kids from tribes around Wisconsin. And these were school-age kids, 5 to 8 years old. So remember, that's kindergarten to 2nd grade. And what she found in her cohort was that about half had overnutrition, so they were overweight and obese. But the most important thing was BMI was really largely determined by their first birthday. This is what that looks like. The different lines are weight class, with the top line being obese, middle being overweight, and the bottom being healthy. You see that these lines were really separated by the first birthday. This is age in years in the bottom, and mean BMI scores here on this axis. So they were really stratified by the first birthday, and they I mean, look at those tight error bars. They really persisted into kindergarten. So what she found was that those infants who were overweight or obese, by the time they were in school, they had greater odds of, continuing to be overweight, continuing to be obese. But then she notes that the lipids started to get abnormal as well. So we're getting the trifecta in these papers that I've been talking about: obese status associated with dyslipidemia, hypertension, glucose metabolism issues. So not good. Interesting to Pete's folks, I would say, is the predictors of BMI at age 1, because unless you're putting soda in a bottle, it's pretty hard to to purposely make an infant obese. So this is what she found as significant predictors of BMI. So macrosomia, so high birth weight, that is for everyone here. And that is a correlate of gestational diabetes. When a fetus sees circulating insulin, there's that insulin-like growth factors. Those are insulin-like growth factor receptors. So what the fetus sees from circulating insulin is basically a growth factor. So again, their bodies are their birth weights are higher. Also, excessive gestational weight gain, again, trying to get at the fact that, maternal diabetes probably has something to do with their offspring's BMI at age 1. And then early termination of breastfeeding was also shown to be important at determining weight status through infancy. And this was less than 3 months of breastfeeding. Good news is that this study, and this is a Finnish study, so non-natives, but if we extrapolate the data a little bit, that cardiovascular disease outcomes in this study for obese children who became non-obese by adulthood were similar to those who were never obese. So those MedPeds folks or those folks who do take care of children or eventually will take care of children, I'm hoping that there's some students here. This is something that we should be focusing on with Native kids. There are other, so it seems like there are, perinatal gestational effects on the adult cardiovascular disease, adult cardiovascular system and subsequent disease. So it does seem that our cardiovascular system is susceptible to injury, from gestation to adulthood. And then other maternal effects really have been linked to exaggerated offspring cardiovascular disease, such as malnutrition, chronic diseases, obesity, diabetes. So we kind of mentioned that, smoking, and then, allostatic load, which is a measure of toxic stress, is also linked to offspring cardiovascular disease. That's toxic stress if it is relayed to an infant, or their offspring, that is also an important measure that you all as internists should be aware of. We in pediatrics really try to look at measures of household dysfunction, parental dysfunction, toxic stress when they're young, and it's based on this study. It's called the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. This was completed through the Kaiser group in California, and basically they measure categories of household dysfunction assigned a risk score that we'll talk about in the next slide. And then they associated that with adult mortality and morbidity of a variety of different type. So this is what they looked at in the study. So they calculated an ACE score, which is basically the number of these toxic categories experienced before the age of 18. So they looked at varying levels of abuse, such as physical, emotional, sexual. If your family used drugs, if a family member had some mental illness, if there was someone in your family in jail, if your parents separated or divorced, if you saw their mother abused, or if they were exposed to varying types of neglect, such as physical or emotional neglect. I will say that we're working right now on an indigenous specific ACE score for our young Indian kids. And it seems that, loss of culture, systemic racism, and other social determinants of health also are important for Indigenous kids as far as these adverse childhood experiences. So ACEs really have long-lasting effects on a variety of different health conditions, behaviors, as well as measures of socioeconomic status. So for health, more ACEs lead to more cardiovascular disease, more obesity, more diabetes, more depression, more cancers, more STIs. If you have more ACEs, you are more likely to smoke or use methamphetamines or drink a lot. If you have more ACEs, you have attenuated graduation rates and academic achievement. And as we all know, academic and educational attainment is the primary driver of socioeconomic status. So it's pretty sobering, I would say. So if we look at cardiovascular disease in specific, that's what this bar graph shows with incident cardiovascular disease risk compared to ACE score, and there's a dose response curve as far as importance of accumulating ACE scores and accumulating risk of cardiovascular disease. So with a lot of these things, it seems that 3 or more ACE score categories seem to be an inflection point that really raises your risk much above baseline. What's the underlying pathophysiology of ACEs, especially for Indigenous folks? So there's probably some systemic racism, generational embodiment of stress, historical trauma. These are passed on to poor and challenging social conditions. These may lead to different adverse childhood experiences, parental dysfunction, household dysfunction, and those sorts of things. This in turn disrupts neurodevelopment, leads to various forms of social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, adoption of health adverse behaviors, smoking, not exercising, using drugs, which leads to disease, disability, social problems, and may explain some of the early death that we see. Of course, ACEs are more prevalent in natives in this country. Don Warren is a very big figure in indigenous health in this country. He's at the University of South Dakota and is one of the deans there at the medical school. But what he taught us was that in his indigenous cohort of 500 American Indian adults, that if they assess their ACE score, about 45% had an ACE score of 3 or more. Remember, that's the inflection point, compared to 17.4% of region max controls. And again, I'm sorry about the white centering. Other cohorts have proved the same thing, basically, with 40% of American Indians adults having 2 or more ACEs compared to 21% of whites, 3 or more at over a quarter of American Indian adults having 3 or more ACE scores based compared to 11.5% of whites. And then you can kind of read the other ones as well. All right. So, okay, well, I'm going to wrap up here, and then we'll hopefully have a few minutes for questions. So what have we learned today? We've learned that cardiovascular disease is a pathologic continuum that begins in gestation. So please consider shifting some of your strategies for primary prevention to earlier and earlier ages, particularly if you're seeing Black and Brown communities that have exaggerated disease states. We have learned that American Indians have accelerated cardiovascular disease mortality as well as early onset cardiovascular disease mortality and morbidity, and that there are easily accessible American Indian specific cardiovascular disease risk calculators that are available through our website. So it's strongheart.org. strongheartstudy.org that are available to you. And I would strongly consider you using these things. Obligatory pediatric kid shot. This picture was when they were younger and liked being around each other a little bit more. But here's my email. Again, I'm available for questions as they arise. Again, if you're interested in advocating more for Native health, please contact me and I can direct you to resources or brainstorm. If you're interested in being involved in some way in the Strong Heart study, I am more than happy to talk about a project with you. The data set for Strong Heart is very rich, and the adjudication has been very strong. So we have tons and tons and tons and tons of data. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Dean. That was wonderful. You probably can't hear, but everybody's clapping. So because of the webinar style.
Yeah, okay. Sounds good. My ears are burning. So.
Yeah, that's right. That's good. Burning in a good way. There are some questions that are coming through the webinar here, and I'll go ahead and moderate those. And then if other people who are still on have questions, please submit those and we'll get those out too. One of the ones that has come through here is kind of getting at, is there data and information on our local Washington tribes? That's one part of it. And then the other is, you mentioned some of the more validated calculators and risk stratifiers for American Indian populations. And do you have a sense that those communities, maybe specifically the ones in Washington, are aware of those calculators, and that's kind of part of the care that's given, is utilizing the calculators?
Yeah. So, I'm a complete hypocrite, and I'm saying that you can, you shouldn't use these calculators, the Framingham for indigenous populations, because they may not work. I mean, I'm equally confused about if you can really use the calculators that we've come up with from our 13 tribal communities to tribal communities out here. So, the answer is probably, but maybe not, I would say. Remember, there are, 570 something federally recognized tribes in this country. There are, over 250 state recognized tribes. So there are 800 genetically distinct groups here in this country that are indigenous. So, can we apply data from one cohort to the other, maybe not. It just depends on your thoughts on why we are seeing exaggerated cardiovascular disease in these groups. If you think there are genetic differences, that's one thing. I mean, that is, I would say, that notion is becoming extinct. But if you more likely say it's because these groups share the same adverse social determinants, then yes, you can probably use them. These are the best data we have for these populations, I would say. So again, applying these calculator scores to local tribes, applying them to Alaska Native people who are very distinct from Indians down here, applying them to Native Hawaiians may be useful. Probably better than Strong Heart, but we don't really know. It's probably better than Framingham, but we don't really know. So
yeah, and there's a follow-up about that Framingham. That the question is the pooled cohort equation, which has largely replaced the Framingham risk score, more accurate with American Indians?
I don't know. I haven't seen those data, so
Okay,
that'd be a good study.
got it.
And
And
update of that validation.
And then someone also asked about, and is there a way when people have multiple racial identities? In other words, does this all fall apart, or do we just do our best?
Yeah. Again, I think that the genetic model of personalized medicine is something that we no longer we're shifting to a state where we no longer kind of put credence in that, and we're more kind of focusing on social conditions. So you can be an Afro-Indigenous person who lives in Pembroke, North Carolina, and you're a Cherokee. And if you're exposed to the same adverse social determinants that someone on Pine Ridge in South Dakota is, I think that you would you may have the equivalent risk, but I think, to be honest with you, it just goes back to maybe gestational and maternal effects, but definitely the social determinants.
Mm-hmm. Someone asked about, have you heard of things that are going on in like Canada with like First Nations communities there? Is there, are there studies that you're aware of?
There are some, because the U.S. system is relatively backwards compared to other large countries in that we value intervention and p-values rather than trying to actually prevent these things from happening. So our patients don't need a pill. So I mean, there are some data. I would say that for cardiovascular disease specifically, they are looking to Strong Heart to inform their activities. So we've been asked to to speak to some groups up there. So maybe not specifically in cardiovascular disease, but lots of governmentally organized large swaths of the population may have more accessible data. So for instance, for congenital heart disease, I mean, the European data is always better than the US data just because of the big cohort numbers. So I haven't heard of much in cardiovascular disease in general, but I mean, in general, they have a better system in dealing with Indigenous health in Canada. So
one of the other questions was, because of this new information that's kind of coming out from things like Strong Heart, have you seen any kind of new initiatives or policy changes or community interventions that have resulted with this attention to the inequities and disparities that are existing amongst this community?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at our more recent papers, I mean, specific to cardiovascular disease, it seems like the health status has improved. So, and it's really important to realize that it's not just us helicoptering into these communities, dropping down scientists to collect data and then kind of disappearing into the wind, right? It's collaborated coordination over decades that has led to these improvements. So that's why this stuff is hard, right? It's this constant back and forth between these communities that are at risk, from the initial kind of cooperative needs assessment for these folks to disseminating the information that we learned to coming up with interventions with them. I would say that in regards to what has been most effective, are interventions that are culturally based for Native communities, and not that are, something that's unfamiliar or something that makes folks uncomfortable. Because again, research in this country, particularly for Black and Brown communities, there is awful precedent. So you really have to remember that, there's a lot of mistrust with Black and Brown communities and us as researchers and, doctors, for instance. So, we really have to break that cycle and say, okay, we want to help you be more healthful. We want to listen to what you think is important for your own communities. We want to work with you to gather these data and learn some of these lessons. And then we want to work with you to disseminate this to your communities so that we can come up with, specific tailored ways based on your own culture, your own, social constructs that would be meaningful and that would help your communities. So it's hard. It's hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think with that, that's where we'll end. And I thank you again for, highlighting and spotlighting, a population, a community, a group that doesn't get a lot of light. Even if what we're seeing is not what we want to see. I appreciate you taking the time with us this afternoon.
Thanks for the invite. It was
All
awesome.
right.
Please don't hesitate to get in contact.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Dean.
Bye.